Hello, a very warm good evening to all of you, and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to the monthly current affairs session for Environment Ecology, where today we are going to cover all the important areas of current affairs which are in news for the month of November, which are relevant both for your exam in the mains perspective as well as the prelims perspective. At the end of each of these topics, we shall also be discussing some of the practice questions, the mains type questions as well as the prelims type of questions, so that you can get an ideal exercise before preparing for the exam as well. So today we are going to have a coverage of topics, as I told you, a mixture of various topics relevant both for the prelims as well as the mains. Now, some of the topics regarding the initiatives which have been arrived at as a consequence of the Conference of Parties number 30, which was held in Belém in Brazil. So, related to that, you basically have multiple reports which are submitted. So, emissions gap report being one of them. Now, previously we had discussed about the adaptation gap report. Now, this is the emission gap report. Then the tropical forever forest forever facility. These are some of the things that we are going to be discussing. We are going to discuss the places, the protected areas in news, why they have been in news, and also the species which has remained in news for the month of November. So that is what we are going to discuss briefly. Now, before we start the discussion for the day, an announcement, important announcement for all of you who are preparing for the examination. Practice of the MCQs is very vital. If you want to get ready for the prelims examination, you can't expect the the questions that you face to be that of the prelims paper itself. So for that, we are conducting the UCSE test, right? Now, this is a scholarship test. Do attend this, do take a look into this, and basically just gauge your overall preparation level. You will be competing with some of the best candidates out there in the country, all of them, most of them in the same stage of preparation that you are. So don't be scared and do take the test. Now, you can attempt the test at 11 a.m. or 5 p.m. and you can register with the link provided in the description below. Now, another announcement for all of you. So while you are covering the portion for current affairs, now economy video regarding new labor codes, the winners, losers, and what changes for you, that has been uploaded, put up on the YouTube channel. Do take a look at it, relevant for the examination and overall understanding about what changes in the labor codes, and is it really a larger reform. Now, starting with the first topic of the day, that is Tropical Forest Forever Facility. Now, what is this Tropical Forest Forever Facility? What is the need for it? And why have we arrived at this particular juncture? So, first of all, we have to understand that when we talk about forests, forests basically serve multiple different purposes, isn't it? When we talk about the forests, so forests are natural regulators of climate. How? So, basically, they influence the amount of rainfall that a region receives. They also influence the temperature in an area. So they always influence the weather and the climatic conditions. It has been found out that in those areas where the forests have been eradicated, there has been reduced amount of rainfall, drought conditions, and overall scarcity of water has been experienced. Other than that, forests are also an important sink for the absorption and storage of carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide emissions that you observe, so all those CO2 emissions eventually they are sequestered and stored by the forest. So that is where the carbon dioxide storage. Now, when you store carbon dioxide, then what happens? So, it is a greenhouse gas. Carbon dioxide otherwise would cause substantial amount of heating and warming of the atmosphere. So, when you store that carbon dioxide, this provides a cooling effect on the planet. You have a cooling effect. Then, other than that, it is also a vital reservoir of all the different types of biodiversity that you have. Biodiversity, right? So, that is where the role of forest is multifarious. Okay. Now, for example, you have the forest distributed across the entirety of planet Earth. Having said that, some of these forests that you would also be knowing about, they are very dense and they are very important. For example, the Amazon forest. Amazon forest in Brazil is very important, considered to be the lungs of planet Earth because they take in carbon dioxide and produce oxygen. Similarly, you have the equatorial rainforest in the region of DRC around the Congo basin. So that is also very important in terms of biodiversity as well as climate regulation, carbon sequestration. Similarly, the rainforest present in the region around Indonesia, Malaysia. So the dense forest always will help the nature and ecology in much greater manner as compared to those forests which have lesser canopy cover. What do we mean by canopy cover, by the way? So let's suppose in an area you have certain trees which are growing, right? Certain trees which are growing. Now, in this case of a tree, the foliage, including the branches, the leaves, everything, this is what is referred to as the canopy cover. Okay? That is your canopy cover. Now, if in a region the canopy cover overall is very high, that means it is considered to be very dense forest. Very dense forest. Now, when you consider the different regions of planet Earth, in the temperate regions, that is in mid latitude, like Europe, like northern portion of America, there also you have forest, but they are not as dense. So their ability to sequester carbon or to host a variety of biodiversity is also extremely restricted. Whereas when you consider the dense forest ecosystem in countries like India, in countries like Brazil, in countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, they are very, very dense. So that is where tropical forests generally are considered to be a backbone of ecosystem services, tropical forests. Now, there is another reality that you should be aware about because you are a candidate for civil services. So you are preparing multiple subjects together. So it is important for you to gain perspectives in all different areas. So, for example, when you consider the tropical forest, any of the regions where these forests are situated, in majority of these regions you will find that poverty also exists. You have large amount of social inequality and so on. As a consequence, the population, the local indigenous population in that area, while they are trying to conserve the vegetation, the forest dwellers, for example, they want the conservation of the forest, but there are many other forces which carry out large scale deforestation. For example, take the case of India itself. The tribal population of India, they are very passionate about conservation of forest ecosystem. But then you have this unholy nexus of politicians, bureaucrats, and the private companies which carry out a large scale systemic deforestation exercise. For example, in the northeastern states like Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Manipur, Meghalaya, the rate of deforestation is amongst the highest in the entirety of the country. And that is where you have the trade of the timber, trade of the forest produce, illegal trade, smuggling activities, which leads to large scale deforestation. In many of the tropical regions also, you will find that there is extension of agriculture. In order to earn, trying to earn more income, what people do, they cut down the forest and they start cultivating in larger areas. So when they cultivate in larger areas, that also leads to deforestation. So tropical forest, they are getting deforested. And the reasons for that, primarily, first of all, is the extension of agriculture. For example, in the region of Myanmar, you will find that almost 80 to 88% of the deforestation of mangroves is owing to the paddy cultivation, increasing the area of paddy cultivation. Similarly, in the region of Nilgiris in Karnataka, if you go to those areas now, you will find that almost all the forested regions slowly and steadily are being cleared off and they are being replaced by coffee plantation, tea cultivation, and so on, which is impacting the biodiversity in that area as well. So, extension of agriculture is a major important factor in influencing deforestation. Other than that, you have the case of urbanization. Urbanization is another factor, right? Then, other than that, you also have infrastructure activities. Infra includes road, for example, roads, railways, right? Dams, water storage structures, All of these, they basically belong to the category of infrastructural activities, which are also damaging the forest ecosystem. So, these are some of the major events which are damaging the overall forest cover, which is having an impact on the cooling activity, and the planet is not cooling at the same rate. Now, that is where, in order to fight and combat climate change, the world that we know arrived at the Earth Summit and basically concluded United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This was arrived at 1992 Rio Summit. Now, the goal was what? The goal basically was to provide a level of cooling. How do you provide cooling? By capturing the carbon dioxide. Removing the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, automatically cooling can happen. Now, what UNFCCC did, it put certain kind of cap in terms of the amount of emission that you can carry out. All the countries, the developed countries, had a kind of a target. You could not emit more than that. But along with that, simultaneous other action was to basically conserve these forests and ensure that these forests, the local indigenous communities, they are made a part of the forest conservation, so that overall climate fight can be carried out. So that is where in UNFCCC you had the Conference of Parties in Warsaw, COP in Warsaw, Poland, right? Before the Paris Agreement. Now, at that point of time, the world arrived at the initiative of Red Plus. Red Plus. What is that? Reducing emissions, reducing emissions from deforestation, from degradation and deforestation. So basically, in case we are not aware, that when you cut down a tree, then it becomes a source of carbon emissions. So deforestation is one of the major sources of carbon emissions in the world, right? So think about it. A forest region ideally will store carbon dioxide. But if you cut down these forests, if you cut down the trees, then the same region becomes a source of carbon dioxide emission and methane emission. So that is emitted from the deforested region. So anywhere where even the density of the trees that reduces, a forest ecosystem is degraded. For example, in the region of Aravalis, we are observing that due to mining, illegal mining activities which are being carried out. So there, when the density of forest reduces, when the forest ecosystem is degraded, then also its overall ability to absorb carbon dioxide that tends to reduce. So, under the aegis of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the world arrived at an initiative known as Red Plus. This was strongly advocated by developing countries like India. Now, the idea was basically that look, countries like India or the countries around the tropical regions, their forests are important and they need to be conserved. But unless and until you make the local population a stakeholder in conservation, you provide them with facilities, you allow for poverty reduction in those areas, then only will they be motivated enough to conserve the forest. So the local community would benefit out of it. However, more than a decade has passed since the Red Plus agreement. Now, the results are still very poor in terms of forest conservation. Every year, for example, in Indonesia and Malaysia, hectares, thousands of hectares of dense forest land is cleared in order to pave the way for palm oil cultivation. Because Indonesia and Malaysia, after all, they are amongst the largest palm oil exporters anywhere in the world. So that is where they carry out a systemic kind of deforestation of these dense tropical evergreen forest. Now, the world has come upon this realization that look, why is it that deforestation is happening? All this is because there is some amount of economic incentive, some or the other economic benefit that people feel that maybe I will gain monetarily if I cut down this tree. So now that the conference of parties is has been held in Belém, Brazil, at the heart of Amazon, or at the mouth of Amazon to be more accurate. Now that is where the initiative of tropical Forest Forever facility has been launched. Now, what is the concept of Tropical Forest Forever facility? The concept is that tropical countries will be given some amount of monetary compensation. When you consider the tropical countries, they will be paid some money. For what? For conserving forest. Now, this is an economic incentive, right? Conservation of forest. Now, this is an economic incentive to these nations so that they can protect the forest, they can conserve the forest. Okay. Now, how much money? Around, let's suppose, $4 per hectare per year. That is the amount of money, approximately $4 per hectare every year. Okay. So, this is the case of the Tropical Forest Forever facility. Why is it needed? To conserve the forest. Now, how does it work actually? So, what is the case is the need is something that we have discussed. Now, what is the mechanism of it? So, mechanism, it is important for you to understand the mechanism as well and pay attention for the next couple of minutes. You will understand the entire story behind the Tropical Forest Forever facility. So, you have various different donor countries. I will show you the list of donor countries, some of the donor countries which have pledged some amount of donation as well, like Brazil, Netherlands, Norway, Indonesia, etc. Now, these donor countries will pool in money, some amount of money. The aim is to galvanize, to get around 125 billion dollars. That is the overall aim. Till now, obviously, it has been launched recently, so that number is very far from realization. So these donor countries will provide some money. Money will be provided where? Money will be provided into an investment fund. Investment fund. Right. Now, what this investment fund will do with this money? The investment fund will take that money and will invest in emerging markets, like let's suppose Indian Stock Exchange or the Pakistan Karachi Stock Exchange, right? So that will be invested in emerging markets, emerging markets. That is where the money will be invested. Okay. Now, once it is invested in the emerging markets, it will yield some returns. For example, let's suppose as an individual, you have donated rupees 1 lakh. Let's assume you have donated a sum of or 10 lakh. Now, out of this 10 lakh, when you have invested in market, you get a return, let's suppose. So the market gives you, along with interest, the market gives you rupees 13 lakh. Let's suppose 30% return you get. Okay. So this is the return. Okay. So you benefit how much? 3 lakh rupees is your surplus. So 3 lakh is the surplus. Okay. That is the surplus. Right. Now, similarly, when the investment fund will invest the money from the donors into the emerging markets, then the markets will give the return. Return. Okay. Now, the return that you generate, you will generate some amount of profit, obviously. So, that will be plowed in conservation of the forest. Conservation of forest. Whereas, some amount of this money will be returned, some amount will be returned to the donors. Okay. So basically, from the market, whatever you are attaining, some amount of it is plowed back to the donors, and then the remaining is moved into the conservation of the forest ecosystem. So that is the entire mechanism how this tropical forest forever facility will work. Okay. Now, looking at this entire schematic, I hope you will be able to pinpoint what is the drawback or the challenge that this entire mechanism will face. One of the challenge that the entire mechanism faces is, what if the market in itself is volatile? Market gives you negative return. Then what? That is, in place of 10 lakh, the market basically gives me only 8 lakh rupees. I am facing a loss of 20%. Then what? Or will that money be given to the donor country, or will that money be provided for the conservation of forest? So, the volatility of the emerging markets is an important point of concern and an important challenge. But other than that, when we talk about these emerging markets, so for example, India, let's suppose the investment fund is investing in Indian Stock Exchange or the Bombay Stock Exchange. Now, in that particular case, will it invest in all the stocks or any kind of stock which grows? No. Those particular stocks or those particular portfolios which are associated with cutting down of trees, like paper companies which still work on the tree pulp. So, those particular portfolios which involve deforestation, those particular portfolios which involve coal, natural gas, petroleum, crude oil, in those portfolios, investment won't happen. So, investment mostly will happen in the case of sectors not associated with coal, oil, deforestation, etc. Okay. Portfolio investment, portfolio investment in which area? In sectors other than coal, petroleum, oil, gas, deforestation, forest destruction. Okay. So, in all these areas, in these portfolios, you basically tend to invest. Right? Now, while this is a good initiative, this is an initiative which will provide the countries with some amount of money, some amount of fund. That is why India has decided to become an observer to this tropical forest forever facility. But at the same time, it basically provides an escape path for the developed nations. Because please understand, the Framework Convention on Climate Change works on the principle of CBDR, common but differentiated responsibility, where greater responsibility on the developed nations are there. Responsibility on developed nations. Okay? On developed nations. Now, in this particular situation, ideally, as per the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the developed nations had to pay the underdeveloped and developing countries with the required amount of funds so that these countries could also develop, they could carry out forest conservation, they could carry out the fight against climate change, and so on. But the reality of the matter is, with the launching of this kind of a facility, now the developed nations don't need to pay any money. So it is challenging the basic principle of CBDR. It is an ideal escape that the developed nations required. Okay. So that is the overall crux of Tropical Forest Forever facility. This is the text that is important for your examination as well. So it is an investment fund designed as a permanent self-financing vehicle through which net returns will be awarded up to up to 74 developing tropical forests and for keeping their existing old growth forests intact. The older forest that they have, that has to be conserved. That has to be okay. Now, the investment mechanism and the entire vessel of investment is something that I have already told you. So, the secretariat called the TFFF and an investment fund called the TFIF, Tropical Forest Investment Fund. That is the investment fund, Tropical Forest Investment Fund. Will invest sponsor money, that is the donor money, the donations. Now, till now, the donations have been pledged by the government of the various different nations. But eventually, if you want to get greater amount of sum invested, you need the private corporations also to put in. So eventually, the aim is to galvanize and mobilize support and finances even from the private sector. Will invest sponsor money in emerging market bonds and avoiding fossil fuels, coal, peat, and any sector linked to deforestation. The TFFF offers new budget neutral model with payment yearly with almost $4 per hectare which has been protected. Investors' initial contribution are invested by the investment fund, and the returns on those investments are used to pay the original investors back in full. So let's suppose Brazil has donated $1 billion. Now, out of that $1 billion, you have made $1.3 billion. So you pay $1 billion back to Brazil, and the 300 million that you have, that you basically use for this particular initiative. That is the entire mechanism. Now, these are some of the commitments which have been made. Brazil has announced a $1 billion contribution. Colombia has pitched up to $250 million contribution. Indonesia contributing almost $1 billion again. Netherlands, $5 million. Norway, $3 billion over a decade, spread over a decade. Portugal, around 1 million euros as well. So all these countries have been donating and have pledged. There are multiple other countries which have expressed interest that they will be donating, but the sum is still not declared publicly. Now, the challenges: too vulnerable to the volatility of the financial markets. That is, what if the financial markets are at loss? Financial markets are at loss. Now, in that case, what will happen to the money? That is still something which is undecided, right? If the financial markets are at loss, then what will happen to that amount of money? The fund dilutes the legal obligation of the developed countries to pay their fair share of the finances. So basically, violates principle of CBDR, the principle of CBDR, common but differentiated response. Okay. Then, because this initiative is not a part of official framework convention on climate change declaration, as a result of that, what happens is that there is no foundation, right? So it is not subjected to the same responsibilities like any UN climate negotiations have. So it can be easily postponed and pushed forward by the countries in case they lack any amount of fund. So that is one of the major lacunae and one of the major drawbacks that this faces. So not officially part of the United Framework Convention. So overall, what have we discussed? What is the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, right? Then what is the mechanism of it? What it seeks to achieve? It seeks to basically prevent the rate of deforestation. It seeks to conserve the amount of forested area overall. Okay. Now, the practice question that you can expect out of this. So we can have a mains type of a question. Discuss the importance of conservation of tropical forest. Why only tropical forest? Of tropical forest. Mention the global initiatives. Global initiatives of TFFF and the mechanism and its mechanism. Okay. Try to write this answer of 10 marks. So, importance for conservation of tropical forest. So, do mention climate regulation also. Do mention the case of the biodiversity conservation also. And do mention the cooling aspect or carbon dioxide sequestration as well. So, that is the case of the tropical forest. So, this you have to also talk about the cases of deforestation. In simple point manner, you can talk about what are the various different causes for this rate of deforestation. And then after that, what is the tropical forest forever facility? That is something that you can mention in detail. Okay. Try writing these answers. The probability of these kind of questions being asked in the examination when there's a major initiative like this, the probability is very high. Now, after this, we come to the next topic, that is COP30, the Conference of Parties number 30, which is held in Belém in Brazil, which has been held in Belém. Now, here we are going to talk about some of the major outcomes of this Conference of Parties. But before that, the basic idea and the basic principles of that. So, this Conference of Parties is an annual meeting, isn't it? It is an annual meeting, right? Now, this annual meeting is a part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It is a part of the United Nations Framework Convention. Now, this United Nations Framework Convention was arrived at when? 92 Rio Summit. Rio Summit. Now, what is the aim of this UNFCCC? The aim is to limit the level of global warming. Limit level of global warming. Okay? Global warming. Then, basically, how do you do that? To limit emissions, controlling emissions. Now, for controlling emissions, what do you need? You basically need to transition into low carbon emission sectors and also renewables. That is what is required. Now, how will you achieve that? Is it the case that a country, let's suppose like Ghana or a Cameroon, or for example, a Malaysia or an Indonesia, do they have enough money to basically provide renewable sector and immediately transition to the electric vehicles and so on? No, they won't be able to do that. Whereas countries, the European nations, the Americas, now they have always had the economic growth backed by emissions. Now, industrial revolution, which led to prosperity in the region of the global north, so to say. Now, that industrial revolution worked upon the greater amount of emissions by burning coal, by burning crude oil, and so on. So that is where, when you take a look at the development of the Western countries, because they have caused emissions historically, that is why they are responsible greatly. So, as per the aspect of UNFCCC, as per the principles of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the aspect is that you have the principle of common but differentiated response, where developed countries have to limit the emissions. Developed countries have to limit the emission. Okay, restrict emissions. Now, this is important for your mains examination and even in the prelims, by the way. That is now being asked. Okay. So, when you have to restrict the emissions, they are being given individual targets. Targets. Earlier, they were given targets in terms of the emissions. And then you also had the facility of carbon markets where you could trade the extra credit that you had, that could be or extra amount of emission that you are not able to achieve your target. So those extra emissions you could basically carry out the trading mechanism, right? Now, these developed nations were also to funding, provide funds to underdeveloped nations and developing nations like India, developed nations, for fighting climate change. Okay, for fighting changing climate. Right? Now, then they also are they were expected to provide technical assistance to the least developed nations, underdeveloped nations, technical assistance for transition to low emission system, for transition into newer technology, right? Because please understand, technology also has got a life cycle of its own. Now, today, for example, in India, we are at a very basic nascent stage in terms of we have started to mature as a country in terms of defense production. But there is a limitation, right? We are still developing some of the critical technologies. So for India to come up with a breakthrough technology which no one else in the world has come across till now in defense tech, it is almost impossible. But take a look at China. They have been working on stealth composites for the past 20 years now. They have been working on AI tools for many years now. They have been working on modern radar systems for many years now. So for them to develop a breakthrough technology, it is easy. Similarly, when we talk about renewables, there also underdeveloped nations will find it much more costlier, much more time taken to switch to renewables. You need better infrastructure, better charging stations, better battery storage, battery technology in itself. Now that the developing nations don't have. Whereas the developed nations have that technology because they have already developed based upon the industrialization. So that is where the developed nations were expected to provide this kind of an assistance to the underdeveloped and developing nations. Have they been able to do so? The answer is no. And that is where the principle of common but differentiated responsibility has been a major pain point. Now, the losses due to climate change have also been massive over the years. For example, in our country itself, we take a look at the impact of climate change. You recently had Cyclone Montha, right? Now, these various different cyclones which hit, now the intensity, you have another cyclone Senyar, which is basically developing in the region of in the region of Bay of Bengal. Now, the frequency and intensity of the cyclones are increasing because of climate change. The intensity and the frequency of cloudburst events that you observe in Himachal, Uttarakhand, Sikkim, Arunachal, that intensity and that frequency is also increasing day by day. So as a consequence, we as a nation face huge amount of monetary as well as losses of personnel. So that is where we are losing thousands of crores every year. So who will provide for that loss and damage? So that is where the loss and damage fund that also the developed countries owe, that was also a major point of concern in the discussions for framework convention on climate change. Now, in this framework convention on climate change, there are certain conference of parties that is important for you. We have done a separate video of what is a conference of party. You have conference of parties for various conventions that is available on YouTube on the same channel. You can take a look into that as well. But some of the conferences of parties, for example, COP3 was held in 1997, and that is where you had the Kyoto Protocol, right? Kyoto Protocol provided for carbon markets, right? Emission targets, as well as the case of carbon markets. Okay, that was provided by the Kyoto Protocol. Then after that, you basically had the Conference of Parties, which was held in Doha, Doha Amendment, and so on. But the major one in recent time was Conference of Parties 21, which was held in 2015. And that is where the Paris Agreement was arrived at. Now, as per the Paris Agreement, now this is important, guys, because you have to understand the aim of the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement was basically different from the Kyoto Protocol. How was it different? In the case of Kyoto Protocol, target was given to the nation. You have to limit your emissions within this. In the case of the Paris Agreement, the nations were given freedom to declare their own target. What is your target in terms of emissions, etc.? So that is where the nations were to declare the intended nationally determined contribution. Each of the nation, what is their contribution in combating climate change? This would be valid for 5 years initially, right? Now, every nation, right, has to provide that. Then, the overall aim is to limit the level of warming to 2 degrees Celsius by 2100 as compared to the pre-industrial era. And if possible, get that warming restricted to 1.5 degrees Celsius uh, by 2100, right? So you have the climate goals. Now, overall, whether a nation is fulfilling the target that they have given or not, that is also important to be verified. For example, tomorrow a country like India can say that, okay, we will not emit anything. Right. But whether are they really emitting something or not? Are we emitting something or not? That is a major point of concern. So that is where a mechanism of global inspection of sorts, what is known as the mechanism of global stocktake, global stocktake mechanism. This has to be carried out every 5 years. Now, in this, what would happen? Inspection. The countries would have to open up for inspection, right? Every 5 years. Now, this is being pushed by various different countries because they have not fulfilled their INDC targets on their own, right? So this was the outcome of the Conference of Parties 2015 in 2020, or in Conference of Parties number 21. Then another major Conference of Parties when it comes to India is the Conference of Parties number 26. This was held in 2021 in Glasgow. Now you have multiple questions. Even this year, a question was asked about the Conference of Parties number 26 also. Now, why this was important was because it was here that India declared its ambition for net zero, and India declared the Panchamrit mission, Panchamrit goals, to increase the amount of renewable energy, to reduce the carbon intensity in the GDP. All this announcement was made here. Paris Agreement, by the way, also works or aimed to achieve net zero emission. What is the concept of net zero emission? That whatever amount you reduce the amount of emission almost to negligible quantity, whatever small amount of emissions are happening, you use that emission basically in order to uh, or whatever emission is happening that is captured by the forest or the natural ecosystem, or you have developed machineries for that. So overall, there is no net addition of carbon compounds happening from your country. So Paris Agreement aimed for net zero to be achieved by 2050. The country should achieve net zero by 2050. Now, as per the Panchamrit goals, India declared we will do it. Net zero will be achieved when? By 2070. That is something which India had declared. Okay. Then after that, Conference of Parties number 27. That was about that was held in Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt. Here, the discussions happened about the loss and damage fund, right? For example, that due to climate change, if there is an economic, monetary, personal loss, then who will pay for that? So you need to have a separate fund for that, right? So L&D, the concept of L loss and damage, that was discussed in great detail. Then after that, Conference of Parties number 28. This was held in Dubai, UAE, right? Now here you had some amount of funding provided to loss and damage fund, close to around 400 $500 million, right? So L&D fund that was worked upon. And mind you, majority of the participants and influencers in this Conference of Parties were the oil producers. After all, Dubai, the entire economy is based on oil production, right? So that was basically dependent on oil. So it was controversial because as long as you use oil, you will keep on emitting, right? There will always be emission. There will be greater amount of global warming also associated. So here, the basic question of when to transition away from fossil fuels, that was immediately rejected, that was avoided. So that target was not arrived at. Rather than that, linkage between health and climate change. Linkage between health and climate, right? Because increasing temperatures, they cause reduced productivity, they cause exposure to heat waves. So that is where you had an open discussion on the link between health and climate. Then you had the Conference of Parties number 29. This was held in Baku, Azerbaijan. Now, here you had the case of financing, where to get the financing for the fight against climate change. So that is where you basically had the arrival of new collective quantifiable goals, right? So that is, or new collective quantifiable mechanism for funding in order to galvanize trillions of dollars funding, right? By 2035. But who will do how much, who will give how much money, that was not decided. So, in the backdrop of this, now you have Conference of Parties number 30. Now, this is held in Belém, Belém, Brazil. Okay, Belém in Brazil is where this Conference of Parties is being held. Okay, now here this was also referred to as the implementation COP. That there have been various commitments which have been done in the past. Now is the time to simply fulfill those particular commitments which have been made. That had been the aim of this. And that is where you basically had some of the key outcomes like increased amount of or increasing the use of sustainable fuels by almost 4 times. But here also, the basic question of mobilizing the finances, that was still in limbo. What is being referred to as the Baku to Belém roadmap, that how do you get that money to be utilized, that is still in a kind of a limbo. So there is not much of a concrete outcome which can be extracted out of this conference of parties, but nonetheless, this conference of parties slowly and steadily is becoming irrelevant because developed nations like US, they are under Trump administration. US has withdrawn from the Framework Convention on Climate Change twice, once in his first administration and second time in his present administration. US has withdrawn from this framework convention. So when countries like US, the largest economy, they are not ready to participate, they are not ready to provide the funding, they think about it as a conspiracy, then why will the other countries like, let's suppose, a France or let's suppose a Spain, why will they give money otherwise? So that is why the funding is not something which has been decided upon till. However, this event of Conference of Parties being held in Belém was important because where is Belém? Belém is situated at the mouth of River Amazon. This is where Belém is situated. Now, this represents a kind of a forested ecosystem in its vicinity. So, this is in the lap of nature itself. So, that is where you basically have the question of indigenous community, their rights, their conservation, the respect that they need, that they require. Then also the case of these particular communities, or rather forest conservation. That is why Tropical Forest Forever facility has been launched, right? So that is why Belém was very symbolic as well. Okay. Now, here, overall, if you take a look at some of the key outcomes, so it was also referred to as the implementation COP. Why? Because as per the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the 30 COP emphasized moving from pledges to whole of economy, whole of society implementation, include the entire community, and basically frame the action points which can be implemented on the ground. However, it was also expected that the global stocktake mechanism the entire mechanism would be finalized here, but it is still far from realization. It is still not finalized. So that was the expectation, right? Now, unless and until you carry out the global stock take, whether any country is following the targets or not, it is up to guess, right? Nobody is following any rules because it is okay to violate a rule. Okay. Over 700 case studies and 570 solution banks were submitted under the climate action agenda. Now, here there was a declaration, what is known as the Belém Declaration on Hunger, Poverty, and Human Centered Climate Action, which sought to link climate change and the impact of climate on the hunger that the population faces. So, heads of state from 43 countries, plus the European Union, adopted the Belém Declaration on Hunger, Poverty, and Human Centered Climate Change, connecting climate action to food security, poverty reduction, and vulnerability. How? Understand this linkage. It is a very simple but an important linkage, let's say. When you have the climate change means what? You have changing rainfall patterns, right? Rainfall patterns change. Now, when rainfall patterns change, so what happens in that? We have been observing that in our country as well. You will have days when there is excess rainfall, and then you have multiple days and weeks where there is no rainfall as well. So, here it can either lead to floods, sudden floods, or it can lead to droughts. In both of these cases, you have agricultural crop loss. Agri crop loss. Now, this agricultural crop loss has got multifarious impact. First of all, it impacts the food security, your food buffer reserves, etc. That declines. So, impacts food security. Okay, that is a major point. Other than that, when it leads to agrarian crisis, right? Farmer income almost reduces. Farmer income reduces. Now, when the farmer income reduces, ability to support family or hunger. Also, please understand that when you have the agricultural crop loss, it also means there is food inflation. Food inflation. And this food inflation basically means marginal and vulnerable communities, they are denied of food. And vulnerable communities are denied. So it again leads to hunger. Hunger increase. So that is why if you want to fight hunger, one of the key ways is to fight the climate change. Okay, so that is where you have the linkage between climate change and hunger as well. Then, regarding the fossil fuel phase out, that fossil fuel phase out, no conclusion could be arrived. No conclusion. So that basically means that even now, the amount of fossil fuel which the countries are planning to use, that is very high, right? So that will never lead to limitation of warming. Will always lead to greater amount of heating itself. Okay, so this is basically due to oil lobbyists. Oil lobbyists. Okay. Now, there was another initiative which has been discussed for some time now, and that is debt for climate swap. What is that? Debt for climate swap. So, it is also an interesting concept of providing funding to the underdeveloped and least developed nations, right? Funding mechanism. How? And how does it work? So let's suppose there is a poor country, very poor country A. Now this country has taken a loan from, let's suppose, an international organization, IBRD, or anything like that. And this loan is worth $4 billion. $4 billion. Now, rather than paying the interest on this loan, let's suppose A had to pay $500 billion or 1 billion in interest pay, right? Let's suppose. Now, A does not have that much money to provide $1 billion immediately. So, what A can do under this new scheme for debt for climate swap, they can basically use that $1 billion for climate action. Climate action. Here, multilateral organizations, multilateral agencies, they have to come to the forefront. And that is what the discussion has been happening for the previous couple of days. So, this again in COP 30, this was a major point of discussion. Regarding mobilization of finances, the COP 30 reinforced the need to scale up climate finances. The Circle of Finance Minister report, so you can have prelims questions associated, that the Circle of Finance Ministers report was associated with which of these events or which of these activities. So the Circle of Finance Ministers report noted that while global flows touched $1 trillion in 2023, only 10% went to emerging and developing countries and less than 5% for adaptation against climate change. So, the funding available for climate change activities that are very restricted, which is the organization which provides funding as per UNFCCC. So, the funding mechanism is provided by GEF, Global Environment Facility. Environment Facility. Okay, that ends up providing funds, provides funds. Now, countries like India have been demanding for a long period of time that this GEF is not very efficient, provides funds to UNFCCC, right? World Bank is the trustee, the trustee. India has been demanding for a long period of time, and also the G77, that is the global south, they have been talking about a long period of time that develop a special purpose vehicle for this, a special separate funding mechanism, because GEF is not efficient. When fund is required, they don't provide the fund, and they are very discriminatory in terms of who will be provided with how much fund, and it is almost subjective in nature. So many of the countries in need, they don't get the required amount of fund to fight against climate change. So while there has been financial flows, the financial flows have been differentiated and also discriminate. Now, the Baku Belem roadmap aims for climate finance from all sources to reach at least 1.3 USD per year by 2035. No commitments have been made by any country till now that this is how much we will provide, right? All of them are trying to escape that responsibility, because please understand one thing, this is about global geopolitics. So imagine you are a country like you. Now, a country like UK, whatever amount of funding you have in the present day volatile world that we live in, you will invest in developing your defenses, in getting more amount of money for welfareism of the population, because you want as a government to be voted back in power. And on the face of it, as somebody tells you that, okay, provide around $10 billion or 10 billion pounds to a country like India, you will obviously not be ready to provide that. So that is where all the developed countries, they are hesitating in providing those. Now, there was a large discussion about just equity and just transition. What is that? So when you are transitioning, let's suppose, from non-renewables to renewables, right? Let's suppose You are transitioning from coal power to solar power, let's suppose. Now, in this particular case, solar power has got its limitations, isn't it? Solar power, unless and until you develop a very capable and a well backed up battery system, solar power works generally during the day. During night time, the solar power does not work. So all the energy stored during the day in the battery that will be deployed during night time. Now, unless and until you have enough amount of deployment of the battery technology, that means not everybody will get that amount of energy, right? Maybe people won't get electricity at all. So, if suddenly you transition from coal power to solar power, there's a sudden transition means what? The electricity rates can suddenly jump, and out of different people, let's suppose there is a billionaire. Now, if there is a billionaire, now they will always be able to secure a separate electricity grid also for themselves if required. And if, on the other hand, there's a poor person, now that poor population will never have the ability to pay at all to deploy for the deployment of the solar cells and the deployment of the solar power at all. So that is where, if there is a sudden transition, that sudden transition can be exclusionary. That can be exclusionary. Exclusionary in the sense that it will deny or impact the marginal and the vulnerable. Impacts marginal and vulnerable population. Okay, vulnerable population. Okay, so if you have to transition in, for example, let's suppose you another example which is apt is, let's suppose today in India you come upon a decision that because fossil fuel and burning of fossil fuel creates too much amount of pollution, so from today petroleum in itself and diesel in itself is banned. Only electric vehicles are allowed. Now you know that the petroleum vehicles, they are available at a cheaper price. Electric vehicles are much more costlier. So when you make this kind of a sudden decision, that means many people, they don't have that much capacity to pay for electric vehicles. They will be left without vehicle. It will be discriminatory. What about the street vendors who still use that two-stroke motor engines in order to drive from one place to another? So that is where it can impact the vulnerable. So you provide a kind of a smooth transition pathway, allow the population to transition easily from one situation to another. Okay. So COP30 emphasized that a just and fair transition is essential, aligning the financial systems, ethical framework, and treating transitions in developing countries with equity. Equity is important because you want the local vulnerable population, the indigenous community, to feel a part of the entire conservation process. Okay, local communities, indigenous population, frontline regions were underscored as key stakeholders. Some of the major announcement: the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, Baku to Belem Roadmap. That Baku to Belem Roadmap is for finances, providing the finances. Belem Forex Initiative. These are relevant for your prelims exam, by the way. The Belem Forex Initiative is what? Countries committed to quadruple the use of sustainable fuels like biofuel, hydrogen fuel, synthetic fuel by 2035 as compared to 2020 levels. That is the Belem Forex Initiative. Okay, sustainable fuels, which will not cause that much amount of pollution. It includes Future Fuel Action Plan and has been endorsed by 23 already. Then Belém Declaration on Global Green Industrialization. So that is basically technology transfer, strengthening industrial standards, and creating green jobs, especially in developing countries which are actually emitting. So these are some of the major outcomes. More outcomes will be clear 1 week down the line, something that you can catch up the next month's current affairs. Okay. What is the way forward, however? You see, every conference of parties, when they are held, there's a lot of hope that the world will arrive at some concrete decisions in order to make the planet cooler, in order to be able to fight against climate change. But then decisions are not taken because the decisions are held by consensus. Unless and until all the countries agree, no particular decision can be taken. That is why you will find that rather than COP being effective, it is on the sidelines of COP that various meetings are held, which are much more effective. Okay, so that is why you need a change in the mechanism of how the COP works. Because imagine you have 192 countries. How easy it is for the oil lobbyists to influence five countries out there. If they pay $10 billion, or let's suppose $50 billion distributed amongst few countries, they will not vote for any change, right? So that is why reform of UNFCC is very important. Reform of UNFCCC is very important. Other than that, global accountability. Any country which is failing its goals, that has to be publicly listed. Okay. Then developed nations have to be pushed for funding. Nations have to provide funds. Okay. That is an essential aspect of it. Only then COP is going to, or these COPs, or this UNFCCC is going to yield some result. As of now, countries, they want to host COP just because they want to be seen as a globally responsible country. COP31, there was already a kind of a tug of war between Turkey and Australia. Now, eventually, Turkey will host it. Now, you will see from this year all the way till next year the amount of brand endorsement and the amount of publicity that Turkey will do regarding tourism aspect, ecotourism, and so on. So, countries are basically using COP platform for different and power projection altogether. That has to move away. Okay. Now, discuss the concept of common but differentiated responsibility. Highlight the importance of just transition of energy for developing nations. So, it is a simple question. This can be answered. So, in the intro, you talk about the concept of CBDR, what it is. Then, in the body, that is when you start to talk about the case that it has been decided since the uh, case of UNFCCC, UNFCCC. Then after that, Kyoto Protocol has highlighted it. Kyoto Protocol has also highlighted it. The need for CBDR, because the underdeveloped nations, they don't have enough amount of funds. Need for common but differentiated responsibility. Okay. And after that, you talk about just transition. Just transition. What it is and why it is important. Okay. Now, then we come to a prelim centric portion, that is the emissions gap report. What is this emissions gap report? What does this report signify and what are the key findings? This is very important for your prelims purpose. The previous two topics and the previous topics were important for your mains exam in general. This is relevant purely for your prelim. So, whenever you have a report, ideally, I would suggest to you prepare an A4 sheet paper, and in that A4 sheet paper, maintain the reports and which is the agency which gives that, and whether that report is annual, biennial, or maybe half yearly. So, what is the frequency of that report being generated? Why I'm saying A4 sheet paper, a brief A4 sheet paper, so that you can revise it as frequently as possible, right? Maybe every fortnight, if you will revise it, it won't be burdensome before the exam itself. So, this is the emissions gap report. It is generated by the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP. UNEP was created when? 1972, as a result of Stockholm Conference. Outcome of Stockholm Conference. Okay. That is when UNEP had been created. Now, what does the emission gap report indicate? So, understand this. In one basic aspect, understand this clear. So, let's suppose you have a country like India. Okay. Now, this is the emission or present emission level. Let's suppose. So, present emission level, let's suppose, is like this for India. Now, in order to meet the goals of climate change, that is to limit the level of heating by 2 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial era by 2100, or 1.5 degrees Celsius if you have to limit the warming. That means what? That basically means that you have to reduce the level of emissions, isn't it? So if, let's suppose, I have to reduce the, or if I have to limit the heating by, if heating has to be reduced or limited, heating to be limited to 2 degrees Celsius, then what? Then I will have a separate amount of emission, let's suppose represented by this. So this should be the amount of emission. However, if the heating has to be reduced further, let's suppose the heating has to be reduced to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the emissions have to be much lower, right? So that difference that you have, so this is as per, if you want to limit the heating by 2 degrees Celsius, if you want to limit the heating by 1.5 degrees, and this is the present level. So the gap that you have in the present emission level to the desired level, that is the emission gap, and that is being generated. So in simple terms, present emission level, present emissions, and desired emission, desired emission. That gap is the emission gap. This gap, the emissions. Okay. Now, it is an annual report released every year around the time when the conference of parties are to be held or are held. Why? Because so that there can be a healthy discussion and a kind of a conclusion, a kind of a decision making can be done, so that the countries can reduce their emissions. The countries can phase out the fossil fuels or something like that. That is why mostly you will find the emission gap report, adaptation gap report, climate change or climate risk index report. All these reports are released around the time of the conference of parties. Now, this report was released by UNEP. Now, this report is titled as Off Target, that the entire world is off target. And the report has said that, look, going by the current scenario, 1.5 degrees Celsius limit is almost unachievable. The countries won't be able to achieve that at all. Okay. So here, the Emissions Gap Report 2025, published by the UNEP, it is titled as Off Target. Now, the world remains substantially out of line with required reduction. If we go as per the present type of emissions, the heating will be almost around 2.8 to 3 degrees Celsius. Okay, that is the amount of heating that we are looking at. Okay, so it evaluates three main categories. First, current policy scenario, what will be the level of heating in that case? If all the countries implement all the NDCs that they have, okay, all the NDCs that they have, the nationally determined contribution, then what? So, full implementation of unconditional and conditional NDCs. Then what will be the level of heating and the necessary pathway to remain within 1.5 degrees Celsius and below 2 degrees Celsius level of heating? So, there are certain key findings. So, under current policy, warming is projected to reach almost 2.8 degrees. And if warming reaches to this level, the impact will be catastrophic. Not only will there be immense amount of heat waves, droughts, droughts, flood cycles, right? More storms, more storms, then rising sea level, rising sea level, impact on energy security, food security, that will be felt. Other than that, loss of biodiversity like the corals, aquatic species, loss of biodiversity, right? All these are basically some of the overall impact. Now, if all the current NDCs are fully implemented, the second scenario, so it works on three scenarios: the current policy, implementation of NDC, and the pathway required to limit the warming to 2 degree or 1.5. So, if all the current NDCs are fully implemented, warming projection lowers to 2.3 to 2.5 degrees. It's still higher than the Paris Agreement target, the Kyoto Protocol target. It is still higher than. And then the report states that 1.5 degrees Celsius target is now highly unlikely to be met unless and until suddenly all the countries start using green energy and so on. We cannot achieve 1.5 degrees Celsius level of heating. At the 2030 horizon, the gap, emission gap, is very, very large. Now, even if all the NDCs were implemented, emissions in 2030 will still exceed what would be required to limit the warming to 2 degree or 1.5. Now, for the 1.5 degree Celsius pathway, obviously, the emission gap is much higher. Now, the key figures and data which have been extracted. So, global annual greenhouse gas emissions are estimated at about 57.7 gigaton carbon dioxide equivalent in 2024. And if you have to align with the 2 degrees Celsius target, the global emissions must drop by 35%. 35%. If you have to meet the 2 degrees Celsius pathway. And this has to be done by when? By 2035, as compared to 2019 levels. Compared to 2019. Okay. Now, if let's suppose you have a target of 1.5 degrees Celsius, then the emissions must drop by 55% as compared to 2019. Okay. So for 2 degrees Celsius target, emissions have to be reduced by 35%. For 1.5 degrees Celsius target, emissions have to reduce by 55%. Only 60 members or parties covering 63% of the global emissions have submitted or announced the updated NDC. India is one of those. Okay. The improvement in projected warming from the current pledges is minimal. Right. Now, the G20 countries amount for almost around 77% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. That is massive. Several G20 members have submitted new 2035 targets. However, many have still done so. When it comes to India, India recorded the largest absolute increase, not the overall, largest annual increase in global greenhouse emissions in 2020. Right. In terms of the growth rate, India's greenhouse gas emissions grew by about 3.6% in 2024, second highest amongst the major emitters after Indonesia. This becomes relevant for your prelims. That after Indonesia, it is the second highest growth, right, in 2024. Now, in India, the growth rate is high, but per capita emission is still very low. Why? It is much lower than the global average. Why? Because the population size is very large. Per capita emission means what? Per capita emission means total emissions divided by total population. Total population. So in our country, the total population is very high. That is why the overall per capita emission level is very low. Now, even after the full implementation of NDC globally, it won't bridge the gap for India. This means that the current policy plus pledge levels will not be enough to fight the risk of climate change. Okay, now let's take a look at the practice question which can be framed from this, and let us arrive at an answer. So, in the context of United Nations Environment Program Emission Gap Report, consider the following statements. The report assesses the gap between the projected global greenhouse gas emissions under current national pledges and the emission levels consistent with limiting global warming to 1.5 or well below 2 degrees Celsius. This is correct. According to the 2025 report, if all current nationally determined contributions are fully implemented, the world is still on track for around 2.3 to 2.5 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century. That is also correct. India recorded the largest absolute increase in total greenhouse gas emission. Absolute terms, largest increase. Percentage terms, second largest. The largest is Indonesia. However, per capita emissions remain amongst the lowest. Correct. To keep 1.5 degrees Celsius warming target within reach, the report recommends that global emissions must decline by at least 35% from 29 levels. Very good. Because this has to be basically reduction by 55%. So the correct answer is 1, 2, and 3. So please do not expect this kind of a question only, that emission gap report is generated by whom. You can have this kind of a question asked in the examination as well. Okay. Now, coming to the next topic, integrity matters checklist. What is this? Integrity matters checklist. Why is it in news? So, giving you a broad gist about it. So, you have various different global corporations, right? FMCG sector, then you have nowadays the tech sector. I hope we are aware that in tech sector, you have to develop data centers. In India, devoting real estate for data center is the new way of earning money. Many of the tech giants are putting in lot of money in order to develop these data centers in rural areas, in suburban areas, and so on. But wherever these centers are coming up, they are using lot of water, creating drought crisis in those countries. Drought conditions are created and caused in those. So that is where the global corporations also have to be made accountable in the fight against climate change. It cannot simply be a fight that the governments will operate upon, whereas the private sector escapes that accountability. That cannot happen. So that is why when we talk about the integrity of the global corporations, they basically will be evaluated on their overall record of how they have been able to fulfill the responsibility that they have. So that is the overall integrity matters checklist. Now, which is the organization which comes up with it? So the Global Reporting Initiative. I'll tell you about the Global Reporting Initiative as well. This is important again only for your prelims, not for the mains. This is relevant only for the prelims examination. Okay. The what, the who, and the how of it. What is it? Then who gets that done? And how is it done? So that is relevant for your prelims examination. Okay. Now, basically, the Global Reporting Initiative has launched a new tool to help companies and investors align their disclosures with the United Nations standard, right? In terms of limiting the level of warming, limiting the level of emission, everything for credible net zero commitment and transition plans. Now, the Integrity Matters checklist developed in partnership with the UN, this is important, maps the recommendation of High Level Expert Group, HLEG, on net zero commitments to the GRI standard, the world's most widely used framework for sustainability reporting. The companies, whether they are operating sustainably or not, So for that, it is important. Now, what is GRI? GRI was launched by UK in 2019 to promote sustainable sourcing and deforestation free supply chains. So it is in order to develop a sustainable supply chain mechanism for all the companies which are involved. Brings together the UK government, industry, and civil society members to align trade and finance with environmental goals, ensuring the commodities like soy, palm oil, and cocoa they are sustainably produced. Is it being done, however? No. For example, when you take a look at palm oil, palm oil is sourced from where? From the region of the Southeast Asian region through deforestation. So it is not sustainably secured. So that is the aim of GRI, the Global Resource Initiative, that all the various companies, whatever activity that they carry out, that has to be done on the back of a sustainable mechanism. The checklist operationalizes recommendation of high-level group integrity matters report, first launched in Conference of Parties number 27, which was held in Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt. Mind you, COP27 Egypt is the loss and damage fund. That is where that was the basic outcome of it. Okay. With a stock take released at C40. C40 is the World Mayor Summit, which was held in Rio de Janeiro. C40 is a grouping of 40 cities of the world aiming for sustainable future, where the mayors of these 40 cities, the heads of these 40 cities, they come together. So that is the C40 summit. It also is being, this is a summit which is now being held annually in order to ensure that you have sustainable transportation system, sustainable waste management, sustainable climate management that is done in the cities, because cities going ahead into the future are going to be the hubs of the population. According to GRI, the tool aligns with the newly updated climate change standard. Now, what are the key features? Ensuring commitments are science based, that is aligned with 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, covered disclosure on fossil fuel phase out. When is it, for example, a fertilizer company, when is it that you are planning for a complete phase out of fossil fuel procurement, transition planning, and just transition impacts, producing decision useful and comparable data for the civil society so that you and I, we can basically make a decision whether, let's suppose, there are two companies, Unilever and Procter and Gamble. So where do I buy my product from? If I get to know by the disclosure, public disclosure of the company, that let's suppose Unilever carries out deforestation in order to procure some of the goods, I will not buy product from Hindustan Unilever anymore. I will keep on buying product from Procter and Gamble. So like that, we can make an informed choice. So when you have a responsible consumption always leads to responsible production mechanism, and that basically brings about greater climate accountability. Why is it relevant? Many entities make net zero or climate commitment pledges without transparency on how or when they will achieve. For example, tomorrow I open a startup in fossil fuel. Now I say that my company is different because I will ensure that the world does not use fossil fuel anymore. I will help them transition away from it. In the name of that, I take in billions of dollars of investment. And I don't declare how will I do it, when will I do it. Right? So that is money wasted. So that is why the resource initiative has come out with the integrity checklist that you have to go for public disclosure and so on. Okay. By linking private sector reporting directly to the climate governance instruments like the Paris Agreement, that any action that you are taking, is it as per the 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius warming goals. Environment finance governance nexus, credible disclosures, they build investor and stakeholder trust. And low carbon organizations, what will they be required? Right, yes, greenwashing is one of those that the organizations, they basically are experts in. So organization will now need to show not just what they promise, but how will they deliver? What are their overall plans? It emphasizes the phase out of fossil fuels and the need to integrate just transition strategy that these organizations need to have. Regulatory regimes. may begin to learn more on the disclosure framework. It is by iteration that you learn. The success will depend upon adoption, integration, and overall what the countries, the regions, they declare as the framework. So that is where regulatory mechanism is also. Now coming to some of the shorter topics, only relevant for your prelims. 94th Ramsar site has been declared again in the state of Bihar, and that is the Gogabi Lake, which is an oxbow lake in the region around Mahananda and the region around River Ganga. So, where is this Gogabi Lake and which are the important species? So, Gogabi Lake is situated in the eastern part, northeastern part of Bihar, right, in the region of Katihar. So, you have River Ganga basically as well as Mahananda. Mahananda is the one which drains like this. So, it is in this region that Gogabi Lake has been declared. Now, this Ramsar site, by the way, so it is one of the first community reserves of Bihar. So Bihar now has got six Ramsar sites. Mind you, few days back you had Udaipur Jheel uh, in Bihar also being declared as a kind of a Ramsar site. So you have Gokul Jalashay also was declared as a Ramsar site a few weeks back. So this is something which is a process where in Bihar wildlife conservation or conservation of these wetlands that is now being focused upon. Now Bihar uh, now has six Ramsar sites, making it third overall in the entirety of the country after Tamil Nadu and Uttar Pradesh. Right? India overall has the largest number of Ramsar sites in Asia, and in the world it is third after UK and Mexico. Right? So India has how much? 94. Right? How do you declare a Ramsar site? So any wetland which is of ecological or natural importance, whether it supports an area of great natural significance, whether it supports any particular biodiversity in its stage of growth, it supports 1% of the unique population of a bird or of a fish, or important region for the migratory species to come in. There also, for example, Gogabil Lake. Gogabil Lake lies in the Central Asian flyway, which is used by the migratory species of birds from the colder regions of Central Asia as well as in the eastern part of Russia to migrate south during the winter. So if it is in the migratory pathway, unique species of bird, animal, or anything like that, that can be declared. So that is submitted by the country involved to the convention, and then the convention approves it as a Ramsar site. Right? So the lake which makes up most of the site is Bihar's first community reserve. It is an oxbow wetland located in the Indo-Gangetic plains, flanked by Mahananda River to the northeast and Ganga River. Mahananda eventually is a tributary of river Ganga. Mind you, this Mahananda has a another tributary, right? So this is basically tributary to Ganga, right? Now, this Mahananda has another tributary, and that is Mechi. In Bihar, in that region, you have the Kosi Mechi Interlink project, which is going on. So that is why Mahananda is something which is also in news. Okay. Now, Gogabil is permanent water body that shrinks, gets a smaller in size during the summer, but it never dries. It is a vital part of the Central Asian flyway. Some of the important species like the common pochard, red crested pochard, bar headed goose, grey lag goose, all these, the pintails, they are to be found. Then Laukhova Wildlife Sanctuary was also in news because wildlife experts and community members in Assam now they have been demanding a Ramsar site status of that region as well. Because please understand, in the northeastern region, now northeastern region is also one of the important areas for migratory species of birds. Now, in those northeastern states, you only have two Ramsar sites. One is Deepor Beel in Assam. Deepor Beel in Assam in the Brahmaputra region, right? Another is the Loktak Lake. in Manipur. These are the only two Ramsar sites which are present in the northeast. So there has been a demand to identify more regions as Ramsar sites so that their conservation can be progressed. So this is the region around the Laukhova sanctuary, okay, in the region around Brahmaputra river system and the Brahmaputra plains that you can see. So civil society organizations and conservationists in Assam have actually urged authorities to declare the Romari Donduva wetland complex in the Laukova Wildlife Sanctuary as a Ramsar site. Right? It is located in the southern part of the Brahmaputra River that we have seen in the Nagaon district and forms the integral part of the Laukova Burachapori ecosystem and is also the buffer zone of the Kaziranga Tiger Reserve. So it is an important ecosensitive area. The vegetation composed can be categorized into alluvial grassland, alluvial forest, moist deciduous forest, and semi-evergreen. So large amount of herbivore population. The faunal species are very diverse. It is home to great Indian one-horned rhino. The entire region around Burachapori, if you take a look at it, the entire region has got a larger population of one-horned rhino. Okay. Then Royal Bengal tiger, then Asiatic water buffaloes, they are to be found. And amongst the waterfowl species, pot-bellied pelican, little and large cormorant are also found in the region. Location is important and why the region is in news. Nora Dehi Wildlife Sanctuary, that will become the third home for cheetahs in MP. Now, as you would be aware, that in the recent trip of the president of India, you had an agreement to bring in more cheetahs in India. Mind you, the cheetah reintroduction program in India has been a mixed bag. There has been a partial success also. For example, recently or a couple of days back, you had a news that one of the cheetahs, which was born in India, she actually basically gave birth to multiple cubs, which means that the cheetahs are now comfortable. The survivability rate of cheetahs in our country is around 60%. Global average is around 40%. So there are some things which are going good, some things which are not going very good. Right. So that is why if you want to reintroduce cheetahs, you want to reintroduce them in as many different landscapes as possible. It is not only Indian born cheetah which is important. It is the fact that Indian born cheetahs are growing mature enough to basically reproduce more cheetahs. That means they have completely acclimatized to the Indian system and Indian ecosystem, so to say. Right? Yes, the name was Mukhi. Correct. So, where is Nora Dehi? Nora Dehi is situated in the heart of Madhya Pradesh. The location is important. It is a part of an important wildlife and tiger corridor. Okay, very important tiger corridor. So, it is the largest wildlife sanctuary in Madhya Pradesh. Entire sanctuary is situated on a plateau, part of the Vindhya range, obviously. So, it is a corridor for Panna Tiger Reserve and the Satpura Tiger Reserve, the Panna and the Satpura. And indirectly, the Bandhavgarh. Bandhavgarh, the home to the white tigers in India. That is the region of Bandhavgarh. Okay. Bandhavgarh via Rani Durgavati Wildlife Sanctuary. So that is the indirect. So this is at the heart of MP, connected in multiple corridors, which the carnivores they tend to use. Because here you have such rich vegetation that large population of herbivores can be supported. So that is why ideal for carnivore. Classified under the Deccan Peninsula biogeographic region. Now, the vegetation tropical dry deciduous and also central Indian monsoon. So you can have some grasslands also, some of the dry deciduous and dense forest. Ideal for the herbivore and supporting the carnivore population. Now, which is the river? North flowing Kopra River, the Bamner River, all these, the tributaries overall of the Cane River. That is something which drains that area. And look at the trees. Teak, moist deciduous, Saja, Dhaura, all these, they are found here. Tiger, panther, sloth bear, wild dog. So you have ample amount of biodiversity in the. Now, coming to the last topic, that is the Indian mouse deer. Now, this is a unique species, the smallest of the deer species that you can find. Now, that is something which had been cited. So, Indian mouse deer, it is also known as the Indian spotted chevrotine. Okay, is a species of even-toed ungulate. Ungulate, for example, Nilgiri tar, the ibex, all these are ungulates, right? Belonging to a separate family. It is the smallest deer species found in India and is elusive, very shy in nature, so or not easily sighted in the wild. That is why when they are spotted, it becomes unique. It is endemic to the Indian subcontinent, mainly found in peninsular India, some records in Nepal. In Sri Lanka, you have a separate species, right? Spotted chevrotine. That is different from Indian spotted chevrotine. Okay. Within India, where it is to be found? Forested areas across Western Ghats and Eastern Ghats up to Odisha, and some forests of Central Asia, Central India. It is 25 to 30 centimeter at shoulder height. 25 to 30 centimeter, you can imagine. This is the size of deer that you are looking at, and only around 2 to 4 kg. Now, what is unique about this deer species is they have tusk-like upper canines, but also four-chambered, right? Instead of the normal ruminants having four-chambered stomach, these have only three-chambered stomach. They have only three-chambered stomach, and they basically forage on the fruits, leaves, and herbs. So IUCN least concern lifespan 8 to 12 years. In certain cases, also observed eating insects, crustaceans, and even small mammals, which makes it different from the other species of deer. So, in which region are they to be found? IUCN and the unique feature. That is something that you have to catch out of it. So, this is what brings us to the end of the session here. I hope the session has been helpful. Make a separate note regarding the case of the protected areas and the species in use. That will be helpful overall for your examination. Okay. If you have liked the content, put that in the comment section, and don't forget to click on the like, share, and the subscribe button. Till we meet again, take care. Goodbye. Thank you.